The Great Freeze, when Earth's springtime vanished. An introduction to nature's most dramatic reversal. Picture yourself standing at the threshold of history's most bewildering climate shift. The glaciers had been melting for centuries, rivers ran wild with freedom, and life cautiously reclaimed valleys long buried beneath ice. Then, in what seemed like the blink of an eye, winter seized the world once more. This wasn't a gradual cooling, or a predictable seasonal change. This was Earth slamming the brakes on springtime itself, dragging humanity back into an icy grip that would last over 1,200 years. What you're about to discover is more than just another tale of ancient climate. It's the story of the Younger Dryas, a period when our planet demonstrated just how quickly it could change its mind. While scientists debate the mechanisms and archaeologists piece together human responses, what emerges is something far more profound. A testament to human resilience when confronted with nature's most dramatic mood swing. This narrative will carry you through landscapes transformed within single lifetimes, through communities forced to abandon everything they knew, and through innovations born from desperation. You'll walk alongside people who watched forests wither, animals vanish, and their carefully built lives crumble under returning ice. Yet these same people would ultimately plant the seeds, quite literally, of civilization itself. So settle in, because this journey through time reveals not just what happened 12 millennia ago, but what it means for our own precarious moment in Earth's long story. The world before the freeze. When we peer back through the mists of deep time to roughly 14,000 years before the present, we encounter an Earth in the midst of dramatic transformation. For countless millennia, glaciers had dominated the northern continents like frozen monarchs, their icy domains stretching across landscapes we would barely recognize today. These weren't merely thick blankets of snow, but massive ice sheets rising miles into the sky, heavy enough to press the very bedrock of continents downward beneath their crushing weight. At the peak of this frozen era, approximately 20,000 years ago, ice sheets sprawled across North America from the Arctic Ocean, down past what would become the Great Lakes. In Europe, similar frozen behemoths covered Scandinavia, the British Isles, and northern Germany. Asia too bore its burden of ice, with enormous glacial tongues extending over Siberian expanses. Together, these ice sheets imprisoned so much water that global sea levels plummeted more than 100 meters below their current height, exposing vast coastal plains where humans and animals could traverse regions that would later lie drowned beneath the waves. Yet by 14,000 years ago, this frozen world had begun its reluctant thaw. Earth's orbital geometry, subtle shifts in its axial tilt, and accumulating greenhouse gases combined to warm the planet. The great glaciers commenced their slow retreat, valleys filled with torrents of meltwater, creating lakes so immense they resembled inland seas. Rivers surged with newfound vigor, reshaping landscapes through their floods. Forests tentatively expanded where tundra had dominated. Grasslands spread across regions once barren and lifeless. For the first time in ages beyond counting, the natural world seemed to be awakening from an extended frozen slumber. This transformation represented both promise and peril for the humans inhabiting these changing lands. These people had already demonstrated themselves to be extraordinary survivors, enduring the worst ice age conditions by hunting the great mammals of the steppe and tundra, gathering whatever plants they could find, and adapting to environments that would challenge even modern survival experts. They traveled in small, mobile groups, following the seasonal rhythms and the migrations of mammoths, bison, and reindeer. Now, with warmth gradually returning, they encountered entirely new environments. Rivers carved paths into continental interiors. Forests offered different game and vegetation. Along coastlines where sea levels had been dramatically lower, people could walk across territories that would soon disappear beneath rising waters. It was during this warming phase that profound cultural shifts began to emerge among human societies. In the Near Eastern regions, groups known as the Natufians started experimenting with something revolutionary. Rather than maintaining constant mobility, they constructed more permanent shelters. They harvested wild grains, stored seeds for future use, and remained in specific locations for extended periods. This wasn't agriculture as we understand it today, but it represented the first glimmers of a transition that would eventually give birth to farming. In Europe, people began creating figurines, painting cave walls, and leaving behind artistic expressions that spoke of their experiences and beliefs. Across Asia, Communities traveled along rivers and coasts, exchanging stone tools, shells, and ideas. This was a world in motion, warming, greening, and growing increasingly diverse. Yet, even as the ice retreated, it did not do so quietly. The melting glaciers released devastating torrents that reshaped entire continents. In North America, the melting Laurentide ice sheet created massive proglacial lakes. One of them, Lake Agassiz, covered hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. It was so enormous that it dwarfed today's Great Lakes many times over. These vast reservoirs of meltwater were inherently unstable, held back only by ridges of ice and sediment that could fail catastrophically. When these natural dams broke, floods poured across the land with unimaginable force. Entire river valleys were scoured clean. New channels were carved through bedrock. Some of these catastrophic floods may have carried enough fresh water into the oceans to disrupt the delicate circulation patterns that regulate Earth's climate. This warming world still hosted an incredible array of animals. Shaggy mammoths, long-tusked mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and enormous bison roamed across continents. Birds larger than humans stalked grasslands. These creatures had thrived in the open, frozen landscapes of the Ice Age, but now, as forests expanded and climates shifted, their habitats were shrinking. Some species adapted to these new conditions. Others did not. Humans hunted them, used their hides for clothing and shelter, their bones for tools, and their meat for sustenance. Living alongside these magnificent beasts required extraordinary skill, cooperation, and intimate knowledge of the land. In turn, the presence of increasingly sophisticated human hunters placed mounting pressure on the very creatures that had sustained them for generations. In Europe, the glaciers' retreat revealed territories buried under ice for millennia. The soil was raw and fresh, quickly colonized by hardy pioneering plants. Soon, birch and pine forests began to take root. Rivers once blocked by ice now flowed freely, carrying fish and attracting diverse animal populations. People followed this northward migration of life, never far behind the shifting boundary between ice and open land, leaving behind stone tools and hearths as testimony to their presence. Across the vast steppes of Siberia, reindeer and horse herds supported human communities that had developed remarkable skills for surviving in such environments. They built shelters from bones and hides, learning to utilize every part of the animals they hunted. Along the coasts of what we now call China and Japan, humans fished, gathered shellfish, and began experimenting with pottery, some of the earliest examples of such technology anywhere in the world. In Africa, warmer climates supported expanding savannas and forests where humans hunted antelope, gathered fruits, and lived in the diverse environments that had shaped our species since its very beginnings. The world before the Younger Dryas was not uniform. While the general trend pointed toward warming, local climates varied considerably. In some regions, ice still dominated. In others, warmth had already brought forests and grasslands. But everywhere, people were adapting, discovering new ways to live, experimenting with novel tools, and slowly beginning to shape the environment around them. Fires were deliberately set to clear land. Stone sickles harvested wild grasses. Settlements appeared with increasing regularity. The seeds of agriculture and permanent societies were quietly being planted, though no one at the time could have known where those seeds would ultimately lead. It is precisely at this moment of change, of warming and promise, that the story of the Younger Dryas becomes critically important. Because just as people were settling into new rhythms, just as forests were spreading and animals were adjusting to transformed landscapes, the sudden return of bitter cold would throw everything into turmoil. Looking back across the millennia, it's tempting to view this warming period as merely a prelude, a fragile pause before winter's shocking return. But for those living through it, this must have felt like a world brimming with possibilities. The long ice age seemed to be loosening its stranglehold. The land was greener, the rivers pulsed with life, and the horizon seemed somehow wider and more inviting. Then, within just a few generations, everything would change again. The retreat of these colossal ice sheets represented one of the most dramatic natural events our planet has ever witnessed, setting the stage for everything that followed. For tens of thousands of years, glaciers had mantled vast portions of the northern continents. They were so thick in certain areas, more than 2 miles deep, that they physically depressed the Earth's crust beneath them. Whole regions were literally pushed downward under the inconceivable weight of frozen water. The Laurentide ice sheet in North America stretched from the Arctic Ocean southward past the Great Lakes, covering nearly all of modern Canada and much of the northern United States. In Europe, the Fennoscandian ice sheets spread across Scandinavia, the British Isles, and northern Germany. In Asia, enormous tongues of ice pushed outward over Siberia. Together, these ice sheets held enough frozen water to lower global sea levels by more than 100 meters. As Earth's orbital pattern shifted and greenhouse gases accumulated in the atmosphere, the balance began to tip. Around 19,000 years ago, the prolonged process of melting began in earnest. At first, the retreat proceeded slowly, but once initiated, it gained momentum. Each summer brought longer melting seasons, and with each passing year, the glaciers lost more ice than they could regain during winter. The edges of the ice sheets pulled steadily back, revealing land that hadn't seen sunlight in tens of thousands of years. Vegetation began creeping into these newly exposed areas. First came hardy mosses and lichens, then grasses, followed by shrubs, and finally forests where glaciers had once scraped bare rock. Entire ecosystems began taking root from scratch. The retreat was neither steady nor uniform. Sometimes glaciers paused their withdrawal for centuries. At other times, they collapsed in great surges. As they melted, enormous quantities of water were released, forming massive lakes across the continents. In North America, Lake Agassiz was the largest of them all. At its maximum extent, it stretched over an area larger than all of the modern Great Lakes combined. Imagine an inland sea filled with icy meltwater, held in place by ridges of ice and land. Similar lakes formed in Europe and Asia, dammed by the retreating glaciers. These bodies of water were fundamentally unstable. When their ice or sediment dams failed, catastrophic floods poured across the landscape. One of the most famous examples of such outburst floods occurred in the Pacific Northwest of North America. Geologists call them the Missoula floods. Repeatedly, as an ice dam broke near present-day Montana, a torrent of water, equivalent to multiple modern rivers combined, surged westward. Racing across Washington and Oregon at incredible speeds, entire valleys were stripped bare. Giant boulders were transported for miles. Deep scablands were carved into the basalt bedrock. When these floodwaters reached the Pacific Ocean, they transformed coastlines in an instant. These events were not minor disturbances. They were continent-reshaping forces, completely reorganizing the geography of entire regions in mere days. The glaciers' retreat also changed sea levels dramatically, as water once locked in ice sheets poured back into the oceans. Coastlines shifted. Land bridges that had connected continents for millennia disappeared beneath rising seas. The most famous of these was the Bering Land Bridge, which for thousands of years had connected Siberia to Alaska. It had provided a crucial migration route for both humans and animals moving between Asia and the Americas. As the seas rose, this land bridge shrank and eventually vanished altogether. Coastal plains that had stretched for hundreds of miles offshore were drowned, leaving behind the narrower coastlines we recognize today. What had been vast hunting grounds and travel routes became sea floors. Entire human settlements may have been lost beneath the rising waters, their traces buried beyond our reach. While glaciers melted and seas rose, the land that had been compressed under miles of ice began to rise back up. This process is called isostatic rebound. When the crushing weight of 2 miles of ice lifted, the bedrock slowly began to spring upward, like a compressed sponge gradually expanding. Even today, thousands of years later, parts of Canada and Scandinavia are still rising by a few millimeters each year as they continue adjusting from the vanished ice sheets. For people living on this rebounding land, the effect would have been slow but noticeable across generations. Shorelines shifted as land rose out of the sea. Rivers changed their courses. Lakes drained or refilled. The Earth itself was flexing and reshaping as it recovered from the Ice Age's burden. The retreat of these giants also meant the retreat of the animals that had lived in their shadow. Mammoths, mastodons, woolly rhinoceroses, and giant ground sloths were among the megafauna that roamed during the height of the Ice Age. They had thrived in the open grasslands and the tundra that bordered the glaciers, grazing on hardy plants and migrating across vast ranges. But as forests spread into these areas and climates grew warmer, their food sources and habitats contracted. Some species adapted to the new conditions. Many did not. The warming period, after the last glacial maximum, coincided with a wave of extinctions, especially in North America, where many of the largest animals disappeared within a few thousand years. Human hunting likely contributed to this decline, adding to the pressures of shrinking habitats. For humans themselves, the retreat of the glaciers opened up tremendous new opportunities. In North America, as the Laurentide ice sheet receded, corridors opened between the ice masses, allowing people to move southward into lands that had been inaccessible for generations. Archaeological evidence shows that humans quickly spread into these new territories, leaving behind stone tools and the remains of campfires. In Europe, the opening of lands in Scandinavia allowed humans to expand northward. Hunters followed reindeer herds into freshly exposed valleys. Rivers became highways of travel and trade, connecting groups across long distances. In Asia, coastal routes opened up, allowing communities to fish and gather along shores that had once been blocked by ice. The melting giants were not only shaping the land and seas, they were also influencing the climate itself. Glaciers are enormous reflectors of sunlight. When they covered large areas, they bounced much of the sun's energy back into space, keeping Earth cooler. As they retreated, darker land and water surfaces absorbed more sunlight, amplifying the warming trend. But simultaneously, the torrents of meltwater pouring into the oceans affected the currents that moved heat around the globe. These massive disruptions to the ocean's conveyor belt may have been one of the triggers for the sudden cooling that marked the Younger Dryas. The Earth was not passively warming. It was lurching, adjusting, and sometimes responding violently to the changes taking place. Life during this time represented a delicate balancing act between opportunity and danger. For humans, newly exposed lands meant more game, more plants, and more places to establish communities. But it also meant profound uncertainty. Floods could erase entire valleys in days. Rising seas could cut off settlements. Shifting climates could change hunting grounds overnight. Communities had to remain mobile, flexible, and skilled at reading the land. They passed knowledge from one generation to the next. Stories of floods, of cold winds returning, of lands that rose or sank. These stories may be the distant ancestors of myths still told today about great floods and frozen ages. In the Middle East, the retreat of the glaciers contributed to a more stable climate that allowed early human groups to begin their first tentative experiments with agriculture. Wild cereals like wheat and barley grew in abundance. People began to harvest and store them, eventually leading to deliberate cultivation. The retreat of the giants created the conditions that made farming possible. Without this melting, the fertile valleys that cradled the beginnings of civilization might never have existed. In South America, the retreat of mountain glaciers opened highland valleys that would support farming communities thousands of years later. The disappearance of ice was not merely an ending. It was a beginning. But the retreat was never a simple linear process. Sometimes glaciers surged forward again, briefly reclaiming land before melting back once more. Climate oscillations were common, with periods of warming followed by sudden reversals. People living through these shifts had no way to predict what would come next. They could only adapt as best they could, relying on mobility, cooperation, and ingenuity. What must have seemed like the final end of the Ice Age was not truly the end at all. The Earth still had one more surprise waiting in reserve. One last surge of cold that would test everything. Humans and ecosystems had learned during the retreat of the giants. And as the warming gathered pace, as rivers swelled and seas rose, as forests spread and certain animals vanished, the stage was being set for that sudden reversal. The Younger Dryas was approaching, and the retreating ice would once again play its part in reshaping the fate of the planet. A climate on the edge. By the time the ice sheets had pulled back far enough to reveal transformed landscapes, Earth's climate existed in a delicate, precarious balance. The world was no longer locked in the deepest cold of Ice Age conditions, but it had not yet reached the stable warmth that characterizes the Holocene epoch we know today. It was a world caught in between, a world teetering on the edge, where small changes in temperature, ocean currents, or rainfall patterns could cascade into major shifts across entire continents. To live during this transitional time was to live with constant uncertainty. Seasons could prove unpredictable. Rains might fail without warning. Cold winds could return when least expected. Entire regions could swing between abundance and scarcity within the span of mere decades. For scientists studying this period today, it stands out as one of the most sensitive chapters in Earth's entire climate history. Ice cores from Greenland reveal wild fluctuations in temperature, sometimes occurring within just a few years. Layers of pollen trapped in lake sediments tell stories of forests advancing and retreating, almost as if the landscape itself were breathing. Geological records document sudden floods, shifting coastlines, and dust storms sweeping across regions that had dried out dramatically. Everything about the planet's climate during this time suggests it was fundamentally unstable, sensitive to even small disturbances, and balanced precariously between ice and warmth. One of the key reasons for this instability was the sheer volume of fresh water entering the oceans. The retreating glaciers were not melting gently like ice cubes slowly dissolving in a drink. They were releasing torrents of water, sometimes steadily, sometimes in violent, catastrophic bursts. These floods poured into the North Atlantic, the Arctic, and the Pacific, fundamentally changing the salinity of the oceans. Salt content is one of the hidden engines driving global ocean circulation. The Great Ocean Conveyor Belt, also known as thermohaline circulation, depends crucially on differences in both temperature and salinity to move water masses around the globe. Warm, salty water flows northward, cools in higher latitudes, becomes denser, sinks to the deep ocean, and drives currents that distribute heat worldwide. But pour too much fresh water into this system, and you dilute it. Fresh water is less dense than salt water. When you make the surface water less salty, you prevent it from sinking as it should. Disrupt the conveyor belt, and you disrupt the entire climate. Evidence suggests this may have happened multiple times during this transitional period. Some scientists believe sudden pulses of meltwater slowed the Atlantic's circulation dramatically, cooling Europe while paradoxically warming parts of the southern hemisphere. Others argue that complex feedback loops between vegetation, ice, and atmosphere created sudden oscillating swings. Whatever the precise mechanisms, the result was clear. The climate could change rapidly, faster than humans or ecosystems could easily adapt. For the people living through this uncertain time, the signs would have been felt rather than scientifically analyzed. Hunters in Europe may have noticed reindeer herds shifting their traditional migration routes, no longer appearing in valleys their people had relied upon for countless generations. Gatherers in the Near East might have observed wild cereals failing to ripen properly in unexpectedly cold summers. Fishing communities along coasts could have watched as storms grew harsher, or fish populations moved into different waters. Life in a climate balanced on the edge was life in constant motion, never knowing whether the next year would bring warmth and abundance, or cold and scarcity. In many ways, this very uncertainty may have spurred innovation. When the environment cannot be counted upon, survival depends fundamentally on flexibility. Groups learned to diversify their diets dramatically, to move whenever conditions changed, to develop new tools and strategies for unpredictable circumstances. Archaeological evidence shows that during this time, people experimented more extensively with grinding stones for processing seeds, with harvesting and storing wild grains, and with processing a wider variety of plant foods. In other regions, they refined their hunting weapons, crafting lighter, more efficient projectile points. These adaptations suggest a direct response to a world that stubbornly refused to settle into predictable rhythms. Animal populations also reflected this climate tension. Some species like reindeer and muskox thrived in cooler conditions and expanded their ranges. Others, like the great mammoths and mastodons, struggled increasingly as forests replaced the open grasslands they depended upon. Predator populations shifted as their prey species moved or declined. Ecosystems that had remained relatively stable for thousands of years began to shuffle like cards in a deck, rearranging themselves with every significant climate swing. To observers at the time, these changes must have been genuinely startling. Imagine witnessing a landscape transform within your own lifetime. Not just season by season, but permanently altered within a single generation. Where once there had been open grassland, now young birch and pine forests might appear. Where once there had been a reliable river crossing used by migrating animals for centuries, floods or droughts might render the route impassable. Dust was another unmistakable sign of a climate on the edge. Geological records from this time reveal layers of fine silt deposited across large regions, carried by strong, persistent winds. This dust suggests extended periods of drying, when vegetation failed to hold soil in place adequately. Dry years would have been harsh on both humans and animals, dramatically reducing food availability and forcing widespread migrations. For those living through it, dust in the air would not have been some distant geological signal. It would have been something tangible, something you could taste on your tongue, feel gritting against your skin, and see drifting ominously in the sky. It was the atmosphere itself reminding you that stability was not guaranteed, that comfort could vanish without warning. The delicate balance characterizing this period is precisely why the Younger Dryas seems so striking in retrospect. It demonstrates what can happen when that precarious balance tips suddenly and dramatically. For roughly 1,000 years, the world had been warming, though unevenly and with occasional setbacks. Forests were spreading, seas were rising, and human groups were adjusting to new environmental patterns. Then, almost without warning, the warmth collapsed entirely, and Ice Age conditions returned with shocking speed. The fact that such a dramatic reversal could happen at all speaks volumes about just how unstable the climate already was. It was perched on a knife's edge, and all it took was one significant push, whether from meltwater floods, volcanic activity, or even a cosmic impact, to send it tumbling back into cold. For modern scientists, this period represents more than just an ancient curiosity. It functions as a warning written in ice and stone. Earth's climate system has demonstrated itself capable of abrupt change, far faster than the gradual, almost imperceptible shifts people often imagine when they think about climate change. A warming world can lurch suddenly into cooling. A cooling world can warm just as abruptly. The triggers may vary considerably, but the inherent sensitivity of the system remains constant. That sensitivity was felt deeply by people 12,000 years ago, and it remains something we continue to grapple with today. The people who lived in this climate on the edge left behind archaeological traces that tell us precisely how they responded to these challenges. In the Levant, the Natufian culture shows compelling evidence of semi-permanent villages, substantial stone houses, and the systematic harvesting of wild grains. But when the Younger Dryas struck, many of these carefully constructed villages were abandoned or significantly altered. People had to adjust when the climate no longer supported the resources they had begun to rely upon with increasing confidence. In northern Europe, evidence of shifting animal bones in archaeological sites suggests dramatically changing diets as prey animals moved away or vanished entirely. In North America, changes in tool styles may reflect necessary adjustments to new hunting conditions as megafauna populations declined precipitously. Everywhere we look, the instability of the climate shaped human choices in profound ways, forcing migrations, spurring innovations, and sometimes causing local collapses of communities. The Earth itself carried the physical scars of this fragile period. Rivers cut entirely new channels through freshly exposed land. Coastlines shifted unpredictably as sea levels rose unevenly. Glacial outburst floods left behind giant boulders and thoroughly scoured valleys. Sediment layers accumulating in lakes and oceans recorded sudden changes in vegetation, temperature, and water chemistry. It is precisely these detailed records that allow scientists today to reconstruct with remarkable precision this climate on the edge. Without them, we would possess only scattered fragments of the story, isolated artifacts and bones with little context. With them, we can see the comprehensive picture, a world in profound transition, teetering precariously between two fundamentally different climate states, acutely vulnerable to disruption. To imagine the daily experience of living through such times is to imagine resilience on a scale most of us rarely consider seriously. Every season carried genuine risk. A warmer year might mean more plants, more game, more fish, and relative abundance. But if that warmth tipped unexpectedly into drought, rivers could shrink dramatically, and crops could fail completely. A colder year might mean reindeer and bison appeared in greater numbers. But if the cold lingered beyond normal patterns, forests would recede northward, and firewood would grow increasingly scarce. Communities had to read the land constantly, interpret its subtle signals, and respond quickly to changing conditions. Those who failed to adapt would not survive for long. And yet, despite this pervasive uncertainty, people continued not merely to survive, but to thrive in meaningful ways. They created art, crafted sophisticated tools, and developed new ways of living. They told stories around fires, raised children with care, and imagined possible futures. The climate was profoundly unstable, but human determination remained remarkably constant. That delicate balance between the unpredictability of the Earth and the persistence of human communities is what ultimately carried humanity through this precarious time. As the warming trend continued, a sense must have gradually grown that the Ice Age was finally, truly ending. Glaciers were retreating across vast territories, forests were spreading with each passing decade, and seas were steadily rising. But beneath that growing hope lay a fragile, uncomfortable truth. The climate remained balanced on the edge, and the Earth was about to remind everyone just how fundamentally unstable it could be. A world turned cold overnight, around 12th Thainrund 800 years ago. Precisely when Earth seemed poised to leave the Ice Age behind permanently, the climate lurched dramatically in the opposite direction. Warming had been progressing for over 1,000 years. Forests were expanding their ranges, seas were rising steadily, and humans in several parts of the world were experimenting with more settled, permanent ways of life. Then suddenly, almost without any warning signs that we can detect, that warming stopped completely. Within only a few decades, global temperatures plummeted back to levels not experienced since the height of the Ice Age itself. In places like Greenland, ice core records suggest temperature drops of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius occurring in less than a human lifetime. Winters lengthened dramatically. Summers cooled. Glaciers halted their retreat across the landscape, and in some regions, they began advancing once again. Scientists later gave this sudden return of glacial conditions a name rooted in botany. They called it the Younger Dryas, after a small Arctic flower whose pollen appeared prominently in soil layers from that period, marking the unmistakable return of cold-adapted ecosystems. To understand just how sudden this event truly was, imagine living in a world where your grandparents remembered warming forests, novel plant species appearing, and progressively longer growing seasons. They would have told you stories of rivers swelling abundantly with meltwater, of game animals discovering new pastures, and of a world slowly growing greener and more hospitable after millennia locked in ice. And then, within your own lifetime, perhaps between your childhood and middle age, the warmth would fade like a dimming fire. The rivers would freeze over for longer stretches of the year. Plants would fail to bloom as expected. The chill of winter would settle into every season, refusing to relinquish its grip. The change happened so rapidly that entire generations grew up under one climate regime only to watch it vanish completely before they reached old age. The Younger Dryas lasted for approximately 1–200 years. In geological timescales, that represents little more than an eye blink. But for the people and animals who lived through those 12 centuries, it was an eternity. It was not a brief cold snap or a temporary setback that might be endured with patience. It was a full, comprehensive return to glacial conditions, long enough to fundamentally shape entire cultures, to dramatically shift ecosystems across continents, and to leave lasting marks on the Earth's surface that remain visible to this day. And when it finally ended, it ended just as abruptly as it had begun, giving way suddenly to the warmth of the Holocene, the epoch that continues to the present day. The cause of this sudden reversal has been intensely debated for decades, with no single explanation gaining complete consensus among researchers. The leading theory involves the delicate balance of ocean currents and salinity. As glaciers melted, enormous lakes of fresh water accumulated across the continents. The largest of these, Lake Agassiz in North America, was dammed precariously by ridges of ice. At some critical point, one of these ice dams catastrophically failed, releasing a devastating flood of fresh water into the North Atlantic. This sudden pulse of fresh water dramatically diluted the salty ocean, interfering fundamentally with thermohaline circulation, the great conveyor belt of currents that carries warm water northward and allows it to sink in the depths, driving global ocean circulation. Without that circulation functioning properly, heat no longer moved efficiently into the northern hemisphere. Europe and significant portions of North America plunged rapidly back into severe cold. Other scientists have proposed different triggers for this event. Some point to volcanic eruptions that could have ejected massive amounts of ash and aerosols into the atmosphere, effectively blocking sunlight and cooling the Earth dramatically. Others suggest an even more dramatic cause, the impact or airburst of a comet or asteroid. Supporters of this controversial hypothesis point to unusual layers discovered in sediments from this precise time period, including microscopic spherules of melted rock and unusually elevated levels of platinum, materials often associated with extraterrestrial origins. They argue that an impact from space could have triggered widespread continental fires, disrupted climate systems catastrophically, and initiated the Younger Dryas. The evidence remains hotly debated and far from conclusive. It may well be that no single cause fully explains this event, and that a combination of factors, floods, disrupted currents, volcanic eruptions, and perhaps even impacts from space, conspired together to push the Earth back into an icy state. For those living through it, the ultimate cause didn't matter in the slightest. What mattered was immediate survival in rapidly changing conditions. Archaeological evidence clearly shows that human communities were forced to adapt with remarkable speed. In the Near East, where groups like the Natufians had begun experimenting with a sedentary village life, the return of harsh cold made wild cereals dramatically less reliable. Some villages were completely abandoned, their inhabitants scattering. Others paradoxically doubled down on cultivating plants more intensively, inadvertently setting the stage for the first true farming communities that would emerge in the following centuries. In Europe, hunters were forced to shift their focus as prey animals moved away, or their populations declined significantly. In North America, the Clovis culture, famous for its distinctive, beautifully crafted spear points, appears to vanish from the archaeological record during precisely this period, replaced by other tool traditions that suggest fundamentally new approaches to hunting and gathering in these harsher conditions. The Younger Dryas was not solely about cold temperatures. It also brought dramatic shifts in rainfall patterns across the globe. In some regions, it meant extended, severe drought. Evidence from Africa suggests that lakes shrank dramatically during this period, turning previously fertile areas into expanding deserts. In Asia, the crucial Indian monsoon system weakened considerably, profoundly affecting rivers and the societies that depended upon them for survival. These shifts in rainfall would have been just as devastating as the cold itself, reducing food supplies dramatically, forcing large-scale migrations, and creating entirely new stresses on human populations already struggling to adapt. Plants and animals responded in dramatic, visible ways to these rapid changes. Cold-adapted species expanded their ranges once again. The Arctic flower Dryas octopetala, which gave this period its scientific name, spread southward across landscapes. Tundra plants replaced forests across many areas. Reindeer and other cold-loving animals thrived and expanded, while species that had moved northward during the preceding warming period were forced to retreat southward again or perish entirely. Megafauna that were already under tremendous stress from both climate changes and increasing human hunting pressure faced even greater challenges. The Younger Dryas may have delivered the final blow to many of them. The mammoth, the mastodon, and other giants of the Ice Age disappeared from Earth not long after this period of renewed cold. What makes the Younger Dryas particularly remarkable is not only the shocking suddenness of its onset and the severity of its cold, but also the equally abrupt manner in which it ended. Around 11,500 years ago, the bitter cold conditions gave way to warmth again in just a few decades, possibly even faster in some regions. Temperatures rose dramatically, glaciers retreated once more, and the Holocene epoch began, the stable, warm period in which all of recorded human history has unfolded. For humans who had endured over a millennium of harsh conditions, this final shift represented a genuine turning point. With the return of reliable warmth, agriculture spread rapidly across favorable regions. Permanent settlements grew substantially. The foundations were laid for civilizations as we understand them. Without the end of the Younger Dryas, the entire trajectory of human history would have been profoundly different. To put it simply and directly, the Younger Dryas was a test imposed by nature itself. It was a 1,000-year interruption, a stark reminder of just how unstable Earth's climate system can be. It forced humans to innovate, to adapt with remarkable speed, and to discover entirely new ways of living. It fundamentally reshaped ecosystems, ended numerous species forever, and redirected the course of history in ways still felt today. And though it occurred 12,000 years ago, its lessons remain powerfully relevant. Because the Earth's climate system, then as now, is not a slow, entirely predictable machine grinding through predetermined cycles. It is capable of abrupt change, sudden reversals, and surprises that can fundamentally alter the fate of entire civilizations in ways barely imaginable until they occur. When we discuss the Younger Dryas today, we're not merely recounting an ancient story for its historical interest. We are gazing into a mirror that reveals how fragile our relationship with climate has always been, and likely always will be. The people of that distant time had absolutely no control over the immense forces that froze their world so suddenly. They could only adapt with whatever resources they possessed, endure with remarkable courage, and wait patiently for warmth to return. In that fundamental sense, the Younger Dryas is not just history locked safely in the past. It forms part of the ongoing story of humans and the dynamic planet we inhabit. A story that continues unfolding in our own climatically uncertain present. And so, after centuries of warming, after retreating glaciers and rising seas, after new opportunities emerging and fragile hopes taking root, the world was thrust violently back into ice. The Younger Dryas had arrived with shocking force, and for more than a millennium, Earth would remain locked firmly in its frigid grip. The freeze plants, animals, and people. When the Younger Dryas began its relentless tightening, it was not merely temperatures that underwent transformation. The living world itself shifted dramatically and comprehensively. Plants withered or retreated to more favorable climates. Animals that had spread confidently into new territories pulled back or vanished entirely from the archaeological record. And people who had started settling into promising new ways of life were thrust back abruptly into the harsh uncertainty of survival under deteriorating conditions. To understand this period properly, it helps to recognize how deeply interconnected these three elements, plants, animals, and people, truly were. One component could not change without inevitably altering the fate of the others in cascading ways. The return of severe cold was most immediately obvious in the vegetation. Before the Younger Dryas descended, forests had been expanding steadily northward across Europe and significant portions of North America. Birch, pine, and hazel trees had been pushing determinedly into areas that had previously been dominated by tundra vegetation. Their expanding presence transformed entire ecosystems, supporting deer, wild boar, diverse bird populations, and countless smaller species. With the sudden onset of bitter chill, that northward expansion stopped abruptly. In many regions, forests collapsed dramatically back into open tundra, now dominated by hardy grasses, resilient mosses, and tough dwarf shrubs. The tiny Arctic flower Dryas octopetala, whose preserved pollen gave this entire period its scientific name, spread southward once again across transformed landscapes. It served as an unmistakable botanical sign that cold-adapted species were aggressively reclaiming territories. This dramatic retreat of forests carried enormous consequences rippling through ecosystems. For herbivores that fed primarily on woody plants and forest vegetation, it meant rapidly shrinking food supplies. For the predators that depended on those herbivores for survival, it meant steadily dwindling prey populations. For humans, it meant the loss of dependable firewood for warmth, building materials for shelter, and diverse food sources they had come to rely upon. Within a single human lifetime, entire landscapes could be utterly transformed, from wooded valleys, rich in varied resources, to sparse, windswept tundra, where survival required constant movement and relentless adaptation. The animal world responded with remarkable speed to these changes. Cold-loving species such as reindeer, muskox, and Arctic hare flourished once more. Their geographic ranges expanded considerably, and they provided vital food sources for both human communities and predator populations. Other species like red deer and wild boar retreated steadily southward, following the shrinking forests that sustained them. For megafauna such as mammoths, mastodons, and giant ground sloths, the Younger Dryas delivered another devastating blow to their already precarious existence. Already under tremendous pressure from increasingly sophisticated human hunting and continuously shrinking habitats, they now faced climates that were far less forgiving than before. Many of these magnificent animals would not survive the 1,000 years of renewed cold that followed. By the time warmth finally returned to the world, they had vanished forever, leaving only their bones and the fading memories of those who had known them. Predators adapted as circumstances allowed. Wolves and foxes shifted their territories along with their prey, sometimes coming into closer, more frequent contact with human groups as they hunted the same increasingly scarce animals. Large cats like the saber-toothed tiger were already in significant decline during this period, their highly specialized hunting strategies making them particularly vulnerable when prey populations changed dramatically. Smaller, more flexible predators fared considerably better. The fundamental balance of ecosystems was being comprehensively reshuffled, and flexibility often determined which species would survive and which would perish. For humans, the Younger Dryas represented a profound shock to every aspect of life. In Europe, groups that had followed expanding herds into newly opened lands suddenly found those same territories far less hospitable than before. Archaeological evidence clearly suggests significant shifts in hunting strategies, with noticeably more emphasis placed on smaller, quicker game animals. When the great herds dwindled or moved away entirely, tools became lighter and more versatile by necessity, specifically designed to adapt to a much wider range of prey species. People had to move more frequently, abandoning semi-permanent camps when food grew scarce, effectively returning to a more nomadic existence after centuries of gradual experimentation with settled life. In the Near East, the Natufians faced one of their greatest challenges yet. Before the Younger Dryas descended, they had begun constructing substantial stone houses, storing food systematically, and living in larger, more stable communities than most of their contemporaries elsewhere. Their lives were gradually moving toward greater permanence and stability, supported by wild cereals that grew abundantly in the warming climate. When the bitter cold returned unexpectedly, harvests grew unreliable and increasingly unpredictable. Some well-established communities were abandoned entirely, their carefully built structures left empty. Others adapted by investing even more effort and innovation into controlling plant growth directly. Instead of abandoning their experiments with cultivation, some Natufian groups began tending wild cereals more carefully and systematically than ever before, eventually leading to the actual domestication of wheat and barley. In this surprising way, the harshness of the Younger Dryas may have directly accelerated humanity's crucial transition toward the agricultural revolution. Without the freeze and its accompanying pressures, farming might have taken many more centuries to develop and spread. In North America, human cultures were also profoundly affected by these changes. The Clovis people, justly famous for their distinctive, finely crafted stone spear points and their successful hunting of megafauna, seemed to disappear almost entirely from the archaeological record during the Younger Dryas. Their decline coincides closely with the extinction of mammoths and mastodons across the continent. As the renewed cold settled in and large animals vanished from landscapes, humans were forced to adapt rapidly. They turned increasingly to smaller game, to fishing and to plant foods, developing entirely new tools and survival strategies suited to the dramatically altered conditions. The disappearance of the Clovis culture remains one of the enduring archaeological mysteries of this period. But it seems abundantly clear that climate played an absolutely central role in their fate. Food scarcity was far from the only challenge people faced. The return of severe cold also fundamentally altered water supplies across vast regions. In Africa, lakes shrank dramatically. Rivers shifted their courses. Once fertile areas dried out completely. Human groups were forced to cluster around the few reliable water sources like the Nile Valley, creating changes in settlement patterns that would influence the region's history for many millennia to come. In Asia, the weakening of crucial monsoon systems created significantly drier conditions across enormous regions, forcing large-scale migrations and demanding new adaptations. These changes would not have been abstract concepts to the people living there. They would have been experienced directly and immediately in the failure of expected plant growth, the drying of wells that had been dependable for generations, and the long, arduous walks required daily to find drinkable water. Cold, scarcity, and pervasive unpredictability also profoundly influenced human culture during this period. Stress and hardship often spark innovation, and the Younger Dryas proved no exception to this pattern. People developed new tools better suited to their changing environments, refined and improved their shelters against the cold, and discovered ways to survive in increasingly harsh conditions. They created warmer clothing suited to colder climates, built sturdier houses that could withstand harsher weather, and learned to store food more carefully and efficiently. At the same time, art, ritual, and storytelling continued unabated. Carvings, paintings, and figurines from this challenging period suggest that even in profoundly hard times, humans actively sought meaning, connection, and beauty in their lives. Survival was never solely about securing food and adequate shelter. It was equally about maintaining community bonds and preserving shared identity through cultural expression. The Younger Dryas also left its distinctive mark in oral traditions that would persist for thousands of years. Many cultures scattered around the world preserve stories of great cold, of sudden catastrophic floods, or of dramatic changes in the environment that altered everything. While it remains impossible to prove direct links definitively, it is genuinely tempting to see echoes of this period embedded in those ancient myths. Tales of lost animals, of endless winters that refuse to end, or of worlds turned completely upside down may represent distant memories passed down faithfully across countless generations. The freeze was so profound and lasted so long that it may still echo faintly in the stories told by descendants thousands of years later. One particularly striking feature of this period is how dramatically uneven its impacts were across different regions. Not every part of the world experienced the same degree of cold. Some areas grew significantly drier rather than simply colder. Others experienced both drought and cold simultaneously. The fundamental instability of the global climate meant that conditions varied dramatically from place to place. For human communities, this geographic variation created both serious challenges and unexpected opportunities. Some groups suffered severe declines and even local collapse. Others adapted successfully and even flourished under the new conditions. The ability to move when necessary, to share accumulated knowledge across groups, and to innovate continuously made the crucial difference between collapse and resilience, between extinction and survival. The freeze also directly shaped the future trajectory of both domesticated animals and cultivated plants. As people began experimenting more seriously with controlling their food sources, certain species were naturally favored over others. Goats and sheep, hardy animals well able to survive on sparse vegetation, became increasingly important in the Near East and surrounding regions. Dogs, already valued companions in hunting, became even more valuable in these harsher conditions, helping track and capture prey more efficiently. Plants that could withstand cold temperatures and unpredictable weather patterns were among the first to be deliberately cultivated with care. These early choices, made under the intense pressure of the Younger Dryas, laid the essential foundations for the agriculture and animal domestication that would come to define human life throughout the Holocene period that followed. The relationship between people and their environment was never more starkly evident than during this challenging period. Every change in vegetation, every shift in animal populations, every variation in rainfall patterns rippled directly and powerfully through human societies. The Younger Dryas served as an unmistakable reminder that humans were not somehow separate from nature, standing apart as observers. They were fundamentally part of it, bound to the same cycles, subject to the same forces, and dependent upon the same resources. Survival meant truly understanding those forces, adapting continuously to them, and sometimes even attempting to influence them, as evidenced by the first deliberate steps toward farming and animal domestication. As the Younger Dryas continued year after year, century after century, generation after generation grew up knowing only its harsh conditions. For them, the cold and scarcity were not temporary interruptions of better times. They were simply normal life, the way the world was, and, as far as they could tell, always would be. Migration became an accepted part of existence. Adaptation was a constant necessity woven into daily survival. Entire lifetimes passed without any hint that warmth might someday return. People were born, raised families with care, and died within the freeze, never imagining that the world could be fundamentally different. It was a 1,000-year winter, long enough to comprehensively define cultures, dramatically shape ecosystems, and permanently alter the course of human history. And yet, even within this prolonged freeze, life continued with remarkable persistence. Plants found protected niches where they could survive. Animals adapted to new ranges and new food sources. People innovated ceaselessly, endured with courage, and carried forward their knowledge and traditions. When the warmth finally, suddenly returned, it would be these survivors, these resilient plants, adaptable animals, and innovative humans that would shape the next chapter of Earth's unfolding story. But during those long centuries of cold, the world belonged entirely to resilience, to those who could endure, adapt, and persist against all odds. Searching for the cause. When people first began systematically uncovering the story of the Younger Dryas through painstaking analysis of ice cores, pollen records, and ancient sediments, the most obvious and pressing question immediately arose. Why? How could the Earth, after more than 1,000 years of relatively steady warming, suddenly plunge back into conditions so reminiscent of the Ice Age, and do so almost instantaneously in geological terms? And how could it then maintain that frozen state for more than a millennium, before switching again just as quickly into the relative stability of the Holocene. The mystery of the Younger Dryas has captivated and fascinated scientists for decades, not only because of what it reveals about our planet's past, but because it demonstrates so clearly how sensitive the climate system truly is to disruptions, and how easily it can flip from one stable state to an entirely different one. The most widely discussed and seriously considered explanation involves the crucial role of the oceans. Our planet's climate is not governed by atmospheric conditions alone, but by the enormous conveyor belt of ocean currents that slowly but powerfully redistributes heat across the entire globe. This circulation system is far from simple. It's an extraordinarily complex network, driven fundamentally by differences in both temperature and salinity, hence its scientific name. Thermohaline circulation, derived from Greek words meaning heat and salt. Warm. Salty water from the tropical regions flows steadily northward along the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. When it reaches colder, higher latitudes, it cools considerably, becomes substantially denser, and sinks deep into the ocean, forming powerful deep currents that travel back southward. This continuous sinking motion pulls more warm water northward in an endless cycle, creating a circulation pattern that transports truly enormous amounts of heat around the planet. Without this system functioning properly, Northern Europe would be far colder than it currently is, closer in climate to Siberia than to the mild, temperate lands we know today. This thermohaline circulation serves as one of the primary engines of Earth's climate system. By constantly moving heat between the tropics and the poles, it helps keep the planet's climate relatively balanced and stable. It also drives crucial nutrient cycles deep within the oceans, bringing up nutrient-rich deep waters that feed plankton populations and sustain entire marine ecosystems. In short, the conveyor belt doesn't merely keep Northern Europe surprisingly warm. It helps regulate the entire planet's climate and fundamental ecology. The significant problem is that this vitally important system is remarkably sensitive to disruption. It depends critically on maintaining the right delicate balance of salt content and temperature. If too much fresh water is suddenly added to the North Atlantic, the surface water becomes less dense and fails to sink as it should. If the sinking process slows significantly, the entire conveyor belt weakens dramatically. If it stops functioning altogether, heat is no longer carried northward in the same effective way, and the result is rapid, severe cooling across the entire northern hemisphere. This is precisely why scientists studying the Younger Dryas look so intently at the massive freshwater floods released from melting glaciers. During the closing stages of the last ice age, meltwater lakes across the continents were absolutely enormous. Lake Agassiz in particular held more water than all the modern Great Lakes combined, an almost incomprehensible volume. For centuries, this inland sea was dammed precariously by ice. Its waters remained trapped on the North American continent. But ice dams are inherently unstable and temporary structures. At some critical point, perhaps multiple points, one or more of them failed catastrophically. When they did, the release of fresh water was devastating beyond imagination. Picture an inland sea, the size of several modern countries, emptying explosively into the Atlantic Ocean in a matter of months or even weeks. The sudden, massive rush of fresh water would have dramatically diluted the ocean's salinity, and with it, the conveyor belt would have faltered, slowed, or stopped entirely. Evidence for this dramatic disruption comes from multiple independent sources that all tell remarkably consistent stories. Sediment cores carefully extracted from the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean show clear changes in the types of microscopic organisms living there during this precise time period. Some species thrive exclusively in warm, salty waters. Others strongly prefer colder, fresher conditions. The abrupt switch between species populations in these cores coincides almost exactly with the beginning of the Younger Dryas. Chemical analyses of the sediments also reveal telling changes in oxygen isotopes that directly reflect shifts in both temperature and ocean circulation patterns. Together, these diverse records point unmistakably to a sudden, severe weakening of the Atlantic conveyor belt, precisely when the Younger Dryas began its icy reign. The Greenland ice cores tell the same compelling story from a different perspective. The sharp, dramatic drop in temperatures recorded there matches closely what would be expected if the conveyor slowed substantially or stopped functioning. Europe and North America would have cooled rapidly and severely, while the tropics and Southern Hemisphere would have been affected in more complex, varied ways, with some regions experiencing significant drying, while others paradoxically warmed. This complex redistribution of heat and altered rainfall patterns fits remarkably well with the global signature we observe in geological records of the Younger Dryas. The conveyor belt theory doesn't explain absolutely everything about this event, but it accounts convincingly for a great deal of what we observe. It explains the shocking speed of the onset, the continental scale of the cooling, and the crucial fact that the changes were far from uniform worldwide. It demonstrates clearly how a relatively localized trigger, fresh water flooding into the hay, North Atlantic, could ripple powerfully through the entire climate system in ways that transformed the Earth comprehensively for more than 1,000 years. For the people living at the time, the oceanic conveyor belt was completely invisible and unknown. They possessed no knowledge of salinity gradients or density-driven currents operating far beneath the ocean's surface. What they experienced directly were the consequences: shorter summers that barely warmed the land, harsher winters that seemed to stretch endlessly, less predictable rainfall patterns, and the inexorable return of tundra vegetation where forests had been steadily growing for centuries. But today, equipped with the powerful tools of modern science, we can see clearly that their immense hardships may have begun with the quiet faltering of an ocean current thousands of miles away from where they lived. What makes the conveyor belt theory so compelling to many researchers is not only that it explains the ancient Younger Dryas event, but that it carries profound relevance for our modern world. Current climate research demonstrates clearly that the Atlantic circulation system is weakening once again. This time because of fresh water input from rapidly melting Greenland ice and increased rainfall resulting from global warming. While a complete, dramatic shutdown, similar to the Younger Dryas, seems unlikely in the immediate future, even a significant slowdown could produce serious consequences. Notably colder winters across Europe, shifting monsoon patterns in Africa and Asia, stronger and more frequent storms in tropical regions, and major disruptions to marine ecosystems that depend on nutrient upwelling. The same fundamental system that shaped the Younger Dryas 12,000 years ago is still operating today beneath the ocean's surface, silently and continuously carrying heat around our planet. If it weakens too dramatically again, the resulting disruptions could be genuinely profound, affecting billions of people. The Younger Dryas shows us with stark clarity what such a disruption looks like in practice. A world turned upside down, not gradually over comfortable centuries, but shockingly within a single human lifetime. And so the great ocean conveyor belt, normally steady and reliable, normally hidden completely from casual notice, may well have been the unseen hand that plunged the Earth back into ice 12 millennia ago. It was certainly not the only contributing factor in this complex event, but it may have been the most critically important. The key mechanism through which other forces such as glacial floods, melting ice sheets, or even cosmic impacts were able to trigger changes that affected the entire world so dramatically and so suddenly. Floods of meltwater. If the Younger Dryas was indeed triggered fundamentally by a major disruption to ocean circulation patterns, then the catastrophic floods of meltwater released from retreating glaciers were almost certainly the most likely culprits behind that disruption. These were emphatically not ordinary floods of the kind we might experience today. They were events occurring on a scale so massive and devastating that it remains genuinely difficult to imagine properly, even with our modern understanding. At the end of the last ice age, enormous lakes sat perched precariously on the edges of retreating ice sheets, dammed by towering walls of ice, or by ridges of earth and rock left behind by glaciers. They were silent reservoirs of potential catastrophe, holding back volumes of water equal to entire inland seas. When their barriers finally failed under mounting pressure, the result was not a gradual, manageable leak, but a sudden, violent unleashing of torrents that comprehensively reshaped entire continents and poured staggering amounts of fresh water into the oceans with consequences that rippled powerfully across the entire planet. One of the greatest of these glacial lakes was Lake Agassiz, which formed gradually across central North America as the massive Laurentide ice sheet melted and retreated northward. At its absolute peak extent, it stretched over an area considerably larger than all 5 of the modern Great Lakes combined, covering vast portions of what is now Manitoba Ontario, Minnesota, and North Dakota. Its waters were held in place by the retreating glacier to the north and by natural ridges of land and ice to the south. For thousands of years, it grew steadily larger, fed continuously by countless meltwater streams flowing from the shrinking ice sheet. But its apparent stability was nothing more than a dangerous illusion. The ice dams holding it back were fundamentally vulnerable to failure, and eventually, inevitably, they gave way under the immense pressure. When Lake Agassiz finally drained, in catastrophic fashion, it did so with almost unimaginable violence and speed. Some scientific estimates suggest that enough water was released in a single catastrophic event to raise global sea levels by several meters, a staggering amount representing countless cubic kilometers of water suddenly freed. Rivers swelled instantly to sizes never witnessed before or since. Valleys were scoured completely clean of soil and vegetation. Boulders the size of modern houses were carried downstream for miles by the incredible force of the water. In the Pacific Northwest, the Missoula floods, caused by a similar repeating cycle of ice-dammed lakes filling and then bursting catastrophically, left behind a landscape still marked today with giant ripple marks in bedrock, deep scablands carved into solid basalt, and flood-carved coulees that testify to the water's awesome power. These were not merely local disasters affecting small regions. They were continent-reshaping forces of nature, completely rewriting geography in mere days or weeks. When these catastrophic floods reached the oceans, they delivered pulses of fresh water so enormous that they fundamentally disrupted the delicate salinity balance required for proper ocean circulation. In the North Atlantic, where normally salty water cooled, became dense, sank deep, and drove the global conveyor belt, this sudden influx of massive amounts of fresh water acted like a physical barrier. The surface layers stayed fresher and significantly less dense than normal, preventing the usual sinking motion from occurring properly. The circulation slowed dramatically or stopped. Heat ceased flowing northward as effectively as before, and the climate shifted almost immediately in response. What had been gradual, progressive warming flipped back violently into full glacial conditions. The physical evidence for these catastrophic floods is literally etched deeply into the land itself, visible even today to trained observers. Ancient shorelines of glacial lakes remain clearly visible high above modern terrain levels. Channels carved by sudden, violent torrents stretch for hundreds of miles across otherwise flat plains. Sediment deposits show precisely where massive amounts of water once surged through valleys and across plains with unstoppable force. In some places, giant boulders called erratics, carried far from their original source regions, testify mutely but powerfully to the incredible strength of these floods. Geologists carefully piecing together these scattered clues see a clear pattern of repeated outbursts, each one capable of causing upheaval not merely locally but on a genuinely global scale. The timing of one of these major catastrophic outbursts aligns remarkably closely with the documented onset of the Younger Dryas, around 12,800 years ago. Compelling evidence suggests that a sudden, massive release of water from Lake Agassiz, or a similar enormous body, entered the North Atlantic with devastating effect. Whether it was one single catastrophic event of almost unimaginable scale, or a series of somewhat smaller but still massive floods occurring in relatively quick succession, the ultimate effect was identical. The conveyor belt faltered severely, and the climate plunged rapidly back into bitter cold. For people living at the time, these floods would have been utterly terrifying and profoundly disorienting experiences. Entire familiar landscapes could literally disappear in mere days. Valleys once rich in diverse plants and abundant animals could be swept completely clean by the raging waters. Rivers that had been reliable sources of water, fish, and transportation could transform overnight into raging torrents absolutely impossible to cross safely. For communities that lived close to these great glacial lakes or along their primary outflow channels, survival would have meant sudden, panicked flight, abandoning everything they possessed and fleeing for their lives as the waters came roaring down. It is not difficult to imagine that vivid memories of such devastating floods became the seeds of myths told and retold. Thousands of years later, stories of great deluges, of angry, vengeful waters, of worlds completely destroyed and then remade by catastrophic floods. Beyond the immediate obvious destruction, these floods created significant longer-term changes to landscapes and ecosystems. New lakes formed as waters pooled in different locations after the main floods passed. Rivers carved entirely new channels, sometimes flowing in completely different directions than before. Sediment was spread across vast plains, enriching soils dramatically in some fortunate places while burying them deeply in others. Coastlines shifted substantially as the oceans rose from the influx. For humans, animals, and plants alike, this meant inhabiting a world in constant, unsettling motion. What had been fertile and productive in one generation could become barren wasteland in the next, while entirely new opportunities might unexpectedly appear where floodwaters eventually receded. The floods also influenced ecosystems indirectly but powerfully through their dramatic effect on climate. By severely disrupting ocean current patterns, they helped trigger the Younger Dryas cold period. The return of severe cold comprehensively reshaped vegetation zones across continents, fundamentally altered animal migration patterns, and forced humans to adapt yet again to radically changing conditions. In this profound sense, the floods were not merely local catastrophes affecting specific regions. They were genuine global agents of change, setting in motion an intricate chain reaction that effectively froze the world for more than an entire millennium. The sheer scale of these floods is extraordinarily hard to overstate or truly comprehend. Imagine standing on the edge of a vast, flat plain and watching with mounting horror as a wall of water dozens of meters high races towards you at tremendous speed, carrying massive icebergs, entire uprooted trees, and house-sized boulders. Imagine the sound, the ground itself shaking violently beneath your feet, the deafening roar of incomprehensible volumes of water tearing through valleys, the air filled completely with mist and flying debris. For those who somehow survived such catastrophic events, the memory would have been seared indelibly into their culture, passed down through countless generations. It is little wonder that stories of great floods appear prominently in the mythologies of so many diverse societies scattered across the globe. The shifting ocean currents caused by these floods did not merely cool the northern hemisphere severely. They altered rainfall patterns dramatically around the entire world. In Africa, crucial monsoon rains weakened considerably, turning previously green, fertile lands back into expanding desert. In Asia, the weakening of the vitally important Indian monsoon disrupted major river systems and severely impacted agricultural possibilities across vast regions. In South America, rainfall patterns changed in precisely the opposite direction, bringing significantly more precipitation to certain regions. These highly uneven effects created a complex patchwork of challenges and unexpected opportunities for both people and ecosystems across the globe. The floods of meltwater may have begun in one relatively localized place, but their far-reaching consequences were felt truly globally. Today, scientists study these ancient floods not only to understand the Younger Dryas more completely, but also to help anticipate potential future scenarios. As Greenland's massive ice sheet melts at accelerating rates, it too releases substantial fresh water steadily into the North Atlantic. Though not yet on the same catastrophic scale as the legendary Lake Agassiz outbursts, the steady flow is already clearly measurable and increasing. If enough fresh water accumulates over time, it could potentially weaken the modern conveyor belt system significantly, leading to climate disruptions that would echo, disturbingly, those of the distant past. The story of the Younger Dryas and its catastrophic flood serves as a stark warning, written permanently in stone and ice for those willing to read it carefully. What makes the story even more powerful and unsettling is the incredible speed of the changes it produced. The Earth's climate system does not always move slowly and gradually as we might prefer or expect. It can lurch violently, driven by sudden events like the catastrophic draining of an enormous glacial lake. One moment, the world is warming steadily, forests spreading gradually northward, seas rising at predictable rates. The next moment, cold returns with shocking force, and landscapes are comprehensively reshaped overnight in geological terms. For humans living then, these violent lurches were not abstract scientific curiosities to be studied dispassionately. They were lived realities that shaped every single decision about where to establish communities, what foods to rely upon, and how to survive from season to season. And so, the floods of meltwater, born directly from the melting giants of the Ice Age, carried far more than just water in their devastating torrents. They carried the raw power to reshape entire continents, to disrupt. Thanks for watching!